Afternoon, bird class. How's everybody doing this afternoon? All right, good. Thanks for putting comments in the chat. That lets me know that you guys can hear me. All right. So you guys got, wow, some of you guys got pretty detailed with the coloring today. Good work. I know you guys enjoy this. All right. But we have to get started. So as usual, we've got a quiz due, a short answer questions due. Both of those are due Sunday, February 27th before midnight. We still have a good month before the project topic requests are due. There's now a content area or module all about the project on Blackboard. So it's got all the information, and it's also got a place where you can submit your requests if you'd like to do that. All right, we were talking last time about evolution. Just to refresh your memory, when we talk about evolution, there are four things that have to four prerequisites or requirements that have to be met in order for evolution to happen. You have to have variation between individuals. Let me write these down for everybody who may have forgotten them. Variation between individuals. Those trait differences or variation is heritable. It gets passed on to the offspring. Resources are limited. There is competition for them. And survival and reproduction is variable. So, generally speaking, oh, Mary, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I can't see half of it.
Okay, hang on a second. Let me move it over here and change the color and see if that helps. Is that better? Or would you like me to go to a whiteboard? Okay. All right, so, goodness gracious. So those four conditions have to be met in order for evolution to happen. Generally speaking, the individuals who are most likely to survive and reproduce are those that are best suited for a given environment. As a general rule in wild animals, usually, well, first off, most wild animals do not make it to reproductive age. And that's true for birds and mammals and reptiles and insects. Basically, across the board, most individuals do not survive childhood. those that do make it to reproductive age, not all of them are going to reproduce. It varies dramatically between species, but as a rule of thumb, somewhere between half and like 80% of females will reproduce, but significantly fewer males will get the opportunity to reproduce. So in some species, it can be as little as 10% of the males who survive to reproductive age. So that's what we're talking about when we say survival and reproduction is variable. I had also talked about mutations or changes in the genetic material. These have to be in the germline. Remember, the germline, those are the cells that are going to produce sperm and eggs. These mutations do not always have an effect. If they have an effect, it's likely to be harmful. It's rare for them to be beneficial. But evolution acts on the ones that have an effect. The ones that are harmful, those individuals are less likely to survive and reproduce, so those mutations tend to be eliminated. Those that are beneficial, those individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce, and those mutations are more likely to then continue in the population and become more common within the population. That's kind of the general overview of big picture concept of evolution. So I'm going to go to the next slide. I have a little more room to write. When we talk about evolution, what we generally think about when we think about evolution is natural selection, right? That's survival of the fittest. And largely that's what I've been explaining when we talk about evolution. It's easy to understand how this one works, but it is not the only mechanism. There's also sexual selection, which I'm going to actually talk about in a few minutes because it's very common in birds and it's very important for bird evolution. And then there are other mechanisms that we are not going to talk about. Things like genetic drift, gene flow, bottlenecks, founder effect. All of these are, gene flow. All of these are forms of evolution that we're not going to talk about. I'm only mentioning them because I want you to understand that there's more to evolution than natural selection and sexual selection. Those are the two we're going to talk about. And I just like this diagram of a secretary bird. You can see the skeleton and then the outline of the silhouette of the bird. I just think it's a pretty cool image. Okay, so survival of the fittest, natural selection. This means individuals, cat, you're in my way. Individuals who are most fit are the ones that survive and reproduce. But fitness means best adapted to the current conditions, to the current ecosystem, where the animal lives, how the animal lives. Their offspring then inherit the traits that make them more likely to survive, and so on and so forth. So fitness can be strongest, but it can also be, oh boy, camouflage. It can be speed. It can be ability to find food, ability to avoid predators by things like hiding, not just fleeing, not just fighting back. So all of these things are forms of fitness. Everybody's probably heard this before. I bet a lot of you have at least. Okay, I'm getting ready to clear this writing. So if you want a screenshot. But I want to talk about sexual selection. Sexual selection is very, very common in birds. And it results in something called sexual dimorphism. Sexual refers to male and female. Di refers to two. Morph refers to appearance. So this translates into males and females look and or behave differently. And this can be things like color. This can be song. When we look at these birds, I don't have to know anything about these birds to say, this has got to be a male. When we looked at the cardinals in the previous image, the males are bright red, the females are just kind of brown, not very exciting. So there's a link to a video about the birds of paradise. It's like a 4-minute video. I posted a link on Blackboard. I really encourage you to look at it because these are the kinds of birds we're talking about, and they are the extreme examples of sexual selection. So what is sexual selection? Again, I'm going to kind of narrow down the discussion. This is the part that we're going to talk about is just what is so important in birds. And in birds, there are traits that females prefer. It's usually females. And so a female might say, okay, look at this bird with the red back and the yellow neck and the blue head. I think he is the hottest thing out there. He's the one I want to mate with. These extreme characteristics, extreme phenotypes, which is the physical appearance, are a way the males signal how fit they are. Look at this bird. Bright, flashy colors. It's going to attract females. What else is it going to attract? Predators. Was that what you were going to say too, Mary? Okay. Yes, predators. So these extreme, if a male has this extreme phenotype and manages to avoid being killed by a predator, that is a sign that he's very successful. He's very fit. And so the traits that we talk about when we talk about sexual selection, traits are disadvantageous or harmful, and they persist or increase. Extreme colors in these male birds are a classic example, the giant tail on the peacock. The male peacocks are the ones with the really big tails. That makes it harder for them to fly. And they fly to get away from predators. So they're more likely to get caught by predators. All right, I'm going to go to the next slide. Not sure why I put this particular slide in here, probably because I like the picture. All right. With these extreme, I'm going to go back. With these extreme bright phenotypes, when an extreme phenotype starts to become common, the females are going to prefer the more extreme phenotype. And so the trait continues to become more elaborate and more difficult for the males to survive with. And that keeps going until it gets to a point where the males basically can't survive with these extreme phenotypes. Okay. Poor guys, they just can't win. Yes, but they're pretty while they're doing it. Questions on sexual selection. I know that was just a quick introduction to the topic. Hi, Fidget. All right, so what I want to talk about next is a little tiny glimpse into the evolution of birds. This, of course, is a shoebill. They're a African species. I mean, look at that. When we talk about evolution, we're going to talk about dinosaurs and how dinosaurs were the ancestors of birds. And you look at something like this, I don't know, I can believe it. This guy looks like a dinosaur. All right. So what makes a bird a bird? We've talked about this. We talked about this kind of at the beginning of the semester. We talk about feathers. Well, this guy's got feathers, right? Feathers everywhere. They have wings. The wings are specially modified front legs. They have a wishbone, which is fused clavicles. They have relatively large brains, except for the ratites, who are stupid, and they are warm-blooded. This is a bird from the late Jurassic period. It's got all the characteristics that we use to define modern birds. It's got feathers, it's got a beak. I don't know if there are any teeth in the beak. Big brain. We'll see the evidence that these guys were warm-blooded. It does have claws on the wings and feet. So that's unusual. And the tail doesn't look quite like a modern bird tail. But otherwise, I mean, if you saw this out in the jungle somewhere, you'd think bird, right? It's amazing how much we have learned in the past couple of decades about how to get information out of fossils. Back in like the 60s and 70s and 80s, fossils were bones. But since then, we've discovered that you can sometimes find impressions of the skin. So you can see what the skin looked like, or if there was feathers. And now we're starting to find some evidence of soft tissue being preserved, kind of, converted into stone in the fossil record. And this is kind of a timeline of evolution of birds from the Triassic through the Jurassic period into the Cretaceous. And you can see that during the Jurassic period, the ancestry of birds and the tyrannosaur type dinosaurs splits off. And on one branch, that leads to T-Rex, and the other branch leads to chickens. Okay. So when we talk about this topic, Fidget, what are you doing? Sorry, guys, my cat keeps doing laps. He gets off the desk, walks around behind me, gets up the desk on the other side, and walks in front of me. I have no idea what he's doing, besides distracting me. Okay, so the theropods are the dinosaurs that are ancestors of modern birds. And they're close relatives. So T-Rex is considered a theropod because he has a lot of common characteristics with the other theropod dinosaurs. T-Rex was not a direct ancestor to modern birds. And the theropod lineage split off around 230 million years ago. So it started really showing up as a distinct lineage at that time period. This is also about the time crocodiles, which include alligators, and the line that led to birds split off. So it's very, very early in evolutionary history here. So the archosaurs, which is the ancestral group that led to dinosaurs, crocodiles, and birds. One line led to dinosaurs and then to birds, and the other line to crocodiles. So the theropods were the first dinosaurs that had what's called bipedal locomotion. Bipedal locomotion. We know what bi stands for nowadays, right? Two. And pedal. What does pedal make you think of? Oh, everybody's being quiet. Movement? Yes. Okay. Feet. There we go. That's what I was asking for. So bipedal locomotion is moving on 2 feet. And so this shows up first in the theropods. Their front paws became modified to help them grasp and tear prey. They were predominantly carnivores, and they weren't particularly smart. So the velociraptor had a skull about the size of a coyote skull, but a brain about the size of a modern pigeon. You guys know how big velociraptors were? Jurassic Park got it very wrong. They're not really small, but they are much smaller than we tend to think about. They're about the same size as a turkey. I don't know how fast they were. They did not hunt in packs as far as we can tell. They appeared to have been solitary, and they lived in desert habitats. Very, very different than what everybody learned from Jurassic Park. So when we talk about the theropods, their front paws were modified for grasping. They got long claws, but one of the things that they lost with those modifications is modifications to the wrist. So our wrist goes back and forth. We can turn it sideways, turn our hand around. The theropods, the early theropod dinosaurs, their wrists were largely locked. They had a little bit of motion this direction, side to side, but not forward to back and not twisting. So this was kind of how they could move their wrist. This is very important for their evolution into birds, because in birds, that wrist bone, if you look at the Archaeopteryx here on the left, that wrist bone allows them to basically fold their wing up very tightly, and it can bend to the point where these bones are lying right along here. So the wrist can point back this way. Generally speaking, the theropods were pretty big. They ranged between 100 and 500 pounds. Velociraptor was one of the small ones, but there were other raptors that were bigger. So how do we go from something like not a velociraptor, something 500 pounds predatory, to tiny seed-eating little sparrows? So this is the most famous bird ancestor skeleton. This is Archaeopteryx. I'm not going to ask you that name. You can see the imprint of feathers along the wing. This is the first known specimen where you could see the feather impressions. And you can kind of see there was some tissue around the head. There were feathers on the tail. Otherwise, it looks a lot like a modern day bird. And on the right, this is a reconstructed image of Archaeopteryx. We can now we can do chemical analysis and make an educated guess about pigment colors. And so we think Archaeopteryx was largely a black bird. So the early ideas about bird evolution was relatively major, significant change, because the first feathered fossils, the Archaeopteryx, looked like birds, and there wasn't a clear progression of characteristics between the dinosaurs and the birds. So it kind of went from land-based animals with simple fuzzy feathers, kind of like down feathers that we see today, or the feathers that you see on the ratites, into something that looks a lot like a bird. Now, the image at the top kind of shows a progression of feather development and the different kinds of feathers, right? So the dinosaurs started out with something that looked much like the modern down. And then they developed these contour feathers, you know, a little bit of structure, but mostly used for insulation. And the smoother feathers, like the tail feathers and the flight feathers, came later. And it's when you see this clear curve on the fossil that you can say that was a flight feather, and that means the bird flew. You can't really see it in this image very well, but that curve is there on these long wing feathers. Then in the 90s, a whole bunch of new fossils came out of China. And it showed widespread feathers. Fossils that didn't have wings, so they had front legs like this guy, but they had a wide range of different kinds of feathers. So clearly feathers evolved before birds. The earliest feathers looked a lot like a hair-like projection that was insulation. It evolved in the theropods. When we look at T-Rex, for example, it had a few feathers, not a lot. But if you want to look at things like the other lineages, the non-theropod dinosaurs, those did have skin more like modern day reptiles, which is what we tend to think about when we think about dinosaurs. Then this was found in South Dakota. It was a strange rock in the chest cavity of a dinosaur. And when they looked at it and analyzed it, they found it had a lot of iron in it, which was not the case for other rocks in the area. And the person who found it said, this is interesting. This is something we need to look at. And so they actually extracted it. Before this point, nobody believed, well, a few people believed soft tissue could be preserved, but most people thought it's not worth saving the rock around the bones because it's just the rock. The bones are the only thing that stays around. Nowadays, we save all the bones around it. When I look at this, I can see a pretty distinctive heart. So here's one chamber, a ventricle, here's another ventricle, here's an atrium. This one was probably lost. We've used CAT scans and found more fossilized hearts, and we know that the theropods had a four-chambered heart. When we talked about bird hearts and how they're four-chambered, does anybody remember why we care about how many chambers are in the heart? I'll give you a hint. Reptiles have 3 chambers. Nope. Okay. A 4-chambered heart. Yes. Thank you, Anna. You got it. A 4-chambered heart means the blood that is rich in oxygen is kept separate from the blood that is poor in oxygen. So the blood that pumps out to the body has a lot of oxygen in it. It's very, very, very oxygen rich. And that is a sign of a high metabolic rate, which is a sign of endothermy, or warm-blooded. Endo refers to inside, therm is like thermometer, it's temperature. So if you see an animal with a 4-chambered heart, it's pretty much going to be a warm-blooded animal, because warm-blooded animals need that oxygen in order to produce enough energy to maintain their internal body temperature. Even more surprising, this heart evolved before the theropods evolved. So this was before the theropods. So were things like the brachiosaurs warm-blooded? It's quite possible. It's quite possible that pretty much everything that we think of as a dinosaur was warm-blooded. There's another piece of evidence for this. Crocodiles have a 4-chambered heart. Now, they're not warm-blooded. They don't maintain a constant body temperature, but they use a lot of oxygen when they are being submerged. So their 4-chambered heart and their lungs, which are more like bird lungs, really help them extract that oxygen so they can stay submerged underwater for longer time periods. Isn't that wild? Or am I just nerding out over here all by myself? All right, good time to take a screenshot. So the wishbone, that fused clavicles, evolved before dinosaurs had wings, and it probably was related to helping the dinosaur grasp and restrain struggling prey with their front limbs. So what separates the birds from the other theropods? What makes, where along this line do we go from a primitive theropod and we stop being theropods and start being birds? There's no clear line in the fossil record that says before this time they were dinosaurs and after this they were birds. It's a continuum with gradual changes. When we talk about the transition to birds, probably the most important change was shrinking body size. So once the lineage that led to birds started shrinking, evolutionary changes started piling up on top of each other, and birds became much more common, much more diverse, clearly able to fly, had a lot of the characteristics involved that we recognize as modern birds. So after a certain point, once the body size got to a certain point, the change from what was clearly a dinosaur to what is clearly a bird really increased in speed. So that was a very important change. It also helped them to survive the in-Cretaceous extinction that killed off the big dinosaurs. Anytime you have a catastrophic event that causes a high rate of extinction, small size will help you survive. The big animals don't usually make it. All right. Any questions on our flight through the evolution of birds? All right, good. So in the lecture plan, the next topic is talking about genetics of birds. And I was working on these lectures this weekend, and I decided that, evolution is really science heavy. Genetics is going to be really science heavy. So I thought we could use a little bit of a break between these two kind of intense topics. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about my favorite group of birds, the ratites. All right. So most ratites that are still alive today are flightless. They're unable to fly. They generally have long legs. They do have a penis. Remember, penis is an unusual characteristic for birds. We saw them in ducks. The ratites have them as well. Generally, they have short wings. So we've got a couple of exceptions to these rules, things like the kiwi and the tinamous, which don't really fit the mold, but we're really going to focus, well, we are going to talk about the kiwi because they're awesome, but we're going to really focus on the classic ratites. We're not going to talk about like the tinamous. The name comes from Latin, ratus, which refers to a vessel, a boat, with no keel. Remember, these birds are flightless. They don't have a keel bone. So their name literally just tells you that they don't have that. Because they don't fly, they don't need that keel to attach these large flight muscles. They don't have large flight muscles. This is a series of different ratites in different sizes. And actually, this guy is one of the dinosaurs. It's in the raptor family. I don't remember which one. This is Utah raptor. This is the terror bird. So it's not all ratites on here. Okay. I'm going to clear the notes. We're going to start by talking about, in fact, we're really going to focus on the extant birds. What does that word mean? Has anybody heard that word before? No. Okay. Ooh, lots of no's coming in. How about extinct? I bet you guys have heard that one. All right. So, extinct. No living members of the species. They're completely gone. Extant is kind of the opposite. There are still living members of the species. So it's species that still exist today. There's one other word that kind of goes with these two. Extirpated, which means a species does not occur in part of the area they used to occur. So in Massachusetts, in the western part of the state, there used to be mountain lions. There are no mountain lions in western Massachusetts anymore, or no breeding populations at least. They've been extirpated. So we're going to talk about the extant birds. And we're going to start really talking about the ostrich. This is the largest living ratite. They can stand between 6 and 9 feet tall, and they can weigh 300 pounds. Bigger than you thought they were, I bet. There are 2 species. There is the Somali ostrich, which is In northeastern Africa, there aren't very many of them. They're not well studied or well understood, and they're definitely not doing all that well. And then there's the common ostrich, which, well, it's common, and it's in the rest of Africa. It is widespread. Go over here. So these are both common. No, wait, this one up here with the kind of bluish leg and bluish neck, that's not the lighting. That is a Somali ostrich. The common ostrich males kind of pinkish legs and pinkish neck. Common ostrich prefers savanna and open brushland. So kind of the typical southern and southeastern habitat that you find in Africa. It is the largest living bird. Now, they can run. They can sprint to 40 miles an hour, or sustained, they can run at 30 miles per hour. They do have wings. Their wings are stubby. They're used for maneuverability during running. So for balance, for making turns and that sort of stuff. They're primarily plant eaters, but also some insects and lizards if they get the chance. I think I've mentioned that in this class before. I can't remember now if I mentioned it in this class or in a different class I'm teaching. There are very, very few species of animals that are strictly herbivores. Most herbivore species will eat insects and small animals if given the opportunity. There are also very, very strict carnivores. So cats are one of the big groups. Cats have to eat meat. They cannot survive on plants. And some people have tried to put cats on a vegan diet. They tend to only live for a couple of years, and they're unhealthy years. So there's not a successful vegan diet out there for cats. All right, screenshot. All right. So ostriches, not very smart. Their eyeball is larger than their brain. Now they have very, very good vision. They have one of the largest eyeballs of land vertebrates, and they use it to spot predators because they are, even though they're 300-pound behemoths, leopards and lions will attack and kill and eat ostrich. They're capable of causing serious injury or death by kicking. So generally speaking, for a leopard or a cheetah to go after an ostrich, it's catching the ostrich while the ostrich is asleep. Lions might attack them while they're awake, but only if they kind of catch them unawares and surprised. And sometimes the ostrich will get a lucky kick in and kill the predator. I mean, they have been known to kill lions. Usually what they do, though, is they run away. You win all the fights that you don't have. They kick when they're cornered, and they don't usually kill people, except in captive situations. Sometimes they will kick a person, and they can kill it. They have very interesting breeding and mating behaviors. So the common ostrich lay eggs in a common nest. So the dominant female in an area keeps her eggs in the center of the nest, and the less dominant females can lay eggs around the edges of the nest. Why do you think the dominant female allows other females to lay eggs around the edges of her nest? Any ideas on that? So their eggs get eaten first. Exactly. Exactly. And when I say a nest, it's kind of a scrape on the ground. Ostriches don't weave a nest like we typically think of. They just kind of scrape a bare patch on the ground. Dominant pair sit on the nest. Occasionally, some of the other ones will, but the dominant male and female tend to be the ones who do the raising of the offspring. The female is on the nest during the day. Male is on the nest at night. It makes sense, right? The male is dark in color. He's going to be hard to see at night. The female, she's kind of the same color as the grass, so she'll be hard to see during the day. All of the adults cooperate to raise the young. So all of the chicks that hatch from the dominant pair's nest, the dominant male and female will walk around. The babies are what we call precocious, meaning when they hatch, they can walk and feed themselves. So the adults are protecting the chicks from predators, but they're not having to feed them. So there's a lot less effort involved. And ostriches, have I mentioned that they're dumb? If you get a pair of ostriches with a bunch of chicks, and they come across another pair of ostriches with a bunch of chicks, they'll both leave with some chicks, but not necessarily the same ones that they started with. And they don't care. So they can, the babies can switch which parents they're following around. Really bizarre. It's not something that you think of as logical. I learned about this because I knew a woman who was trying to research parental care in ostriches, and she was having a lot of trouble with it. And one of the reasons she was having trouble was that the chicks would follow different parents around if they intersected with another group. So she'd be following a pair of adults, and she'd say, okay, well, they've got 12 chicks today, and then the next week they'd have 14. And then the next week they'd have 6, but she didn't know if that meant that they'd lost 6 or if those others had gone off with another pair of adults. I felt really sorry for her. That was a hard thing to try and study. Now, ostriches do not bury their head in the sand. Ostriches feed from the ground. And so if you see an ostrich with its head down next to the ground, it's because it's eating something on the ground, not because it's hiding. common ostrich here, they're in pretty good shape. The population is declining primarily due to habitat loss, but there's still plenty of them around. The Somali ostrich is listed as vulnerable due to habitat loss and hunting, but it has a much smaller area that it can be found in, whereas the common ostrich can be found across a huge portion of Africa. There are a couple of recently extinct species. So there used to be ostriches in China, and there are pictures of ostriches on early Chinese pottery and petroglyphs, but it's been extinct for a while. And then there was a species of ostrich in Arabia, Saudi Arabia, and the Arabian Peninsula that was last seen in the 1920s. And of course, nowadays, ostrich are domesticated and they can be farmed for their meat, for ostrich leather, and for feathers. In Australia, some of them have escaped from farms, and now there are feral ostriches in the outback. You guys know feral means a domestic animal that has escaped and is living in the wild where it should not be. So if ostriches escape in Africa, well, they live there anyway, so that's not a big deal. But if they're in Australia, that's a problem. And I do have an ostrich egg. So there's your ostrich egg. It's really tough, hard shelled, much harder than what you would expect, much harder than chicken egg shells. And yeah, pretty big. All right. And that's our quick look at ostriches. Will they eat the eggs if they get stepped on? Oh, I would say probably, but those eggshells are pretty damn tough. I think they would have to it would take a lot of effort to crack one open, even if they stepped on them. They would have to have their whole weight on one egg instead of partly on the egg and partly on the ground or partly on 3 different eggs. I don't know for sure, but I would suspect they would eat the eggs if they did crack one open. And part of that would also be protecting the rest of the eggs, because eggs are a very nutritious food source, and a cracked egg will attract a lot of wildlife that might go after the other eggs, and it could also get infected with bacteria, which could then spread to the other chicks. All right, next in size to the ostrich is the emu. These guys are between 5 and 6 feet tall and up to about 130 pounds. So even though they're almost as tall as the ostrich, they don't weigh as much. While there are some places where populations are declining, they're in really good shape. Their population is in, there's a lot of wild emu. Their big problems: habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. So many of them die on the road. They get hit by cars. These are native to Australia. And like the ostrich, they have excellent eyesight. And will flee from predators. And like the ostrich, they like relatively dry, open type habitats, like scrubland or open forest. You can see a few trees in the background, but it's nothing like the trees you guys see in Massachusetts. Now, these guys are what is called polyandric. You've heard of polygamy. Polyandry is one female, multiple males. So in a really good year, one female might mate and lay eggs with 3 different males. The males do the childcare. So the female comes along, the male has made a nest, she lays her eggs in his nest, and then she goes off and finds another guy. They do make noises. We don't call it singing. Their noises are booming, grunting, and hissing. They have this inflatable sac in their throat that allows them to make very loud, very deep sounds. And they make these booming sounds for the same reason other birds sing, declaring territory and attracting mates. And a really loud boom can be heard over a mile away. So again, they're very, very similar to ostriches. They eat similar foods, plants and insects, with the occasional lizard, probably the occasional mouse. Like ostriches, they're relatively common in captivity. They're farmed for meat and feathers and leather. There are laws that prohibit hunting wild emu for commercial use. So in Australia, you can't just go out and shoot wild emus and sell their meat and their feathers and such. They're protected. Okay, if you haven't taken a screenshot, this is a good place to do that. Because the next thing I want to tell you about are the Emu Wars. Great Emu War. So there are 2 countries which have declared wars on birds. Australia, which declared war on the emu, and China, which declared war on the sparrow. In both cases, the birds won. So in 1932, this was after World War I. It was during the time known as the Great Depression. So things were rough all around the world. And a lot of military veterans were given land in the western part of Australia. So over here, the left part of Australia on this map, to farm. Now, this wasn't really good farmland. It was relatively hot, relatively dry. The government said, well, we're going to subsidize you so you can manage to farm this land. And then the government reneged on their promise and didn't give the veterans money. So outside of breeding season, like most birds, emus are very social, and they can have flocks up to around 20,000 birds. Think about this. You're a farmer. 20,000 100-pound birds come walking into your farm, and they're plant eaters. What do you think is going to happen? They're going to eat your crops, right? So they ate the crops. They drank up the water that was brought in for livestock. They knocked down fences. And the government just agreed that some of these ex-military people could use machine guns to try and kill off the emu to help protect these farms, even though there was crappy land and they really shouldn't have been farming there. The local farmers had to pay for the ammunition and provide room and board for the military. So by the time the troops and the machine guns arrived, the weather had changed and these giant flocks had kind of broken up, and the emus were dispersed over a much wider area, which made it harder to find them. So they went out and they would find small groups and they would fire on them, and the emus changed their behavior. So in response to being hunted like this, they started posting a lookout. So each group would have at least one lookout watching for people. The guys would drive up in the trucks. The lookout would see it way off in the distance, and the emus would leave. And the troops weren't able to get close enough, even with machine guns, to shoot the emus. Here's a quote. The machine gunners' dreams of point-blank fire into masses of emus were soon dissipated. The emu command had evidently ordered guerrilla tactics, and its unwieldy army soon split up into innumerable small units that made use of the military equipment uneconomic. A crestfallen field force thereafter withdrew from the combat area after about a month. We'll add to the fact they often couldn't follow the emus across the rough terrain in their trucks. So the Great Emu War lasted around 6 days. 2,500 bullets were fired. An estimated 50 to maybe 200 birds died. And there were no human casualties. But their absolute failure to make a dent in the emu population got into the press heard about this, and the bad press really brought the Great Emu War to an end. Eventually, better fencing helped keep emu out of agricultural areas, but emus won, Australia 0. All right, the chat's been quiet today. Any questions about the Great Emu War? Nothing. Okay. So I mentioned that China declared war on sparrows. This was in the 1950s. Yeah. Any cool cartoons about it? Oh, I haven't seen any, but I do have a picture that's worth sharing. It's going to take me a minute. So, come on, Those you. I love this picture. The emu commander. All right, so China declared war on sparrows, thinking that because sparrows also eat crops. And in China, they commanded the people to kill and harass sparrows. And the people actually did. They would go out and they would harass sparrows anytime the birds landed. And basically, large numbers of sparrows ended up dying from sheer exhaustion. So they did kill a lot of sparrows. But it turns out that while the sparrows were eating some crops, they were also eating all the bugs on the crops. And so after they reduced the sparrow population too far, the harvest didn't produce as much food because all the bugs ate it. And so China lost that war, just like Australia did. Okay. And on those amusing notes, I think this is a good place to stop for the day. There was no short answer on Blackboard. I will have to, make a note to look at that. There should be some short answer questions. I may have just missed the posting. The project submission form should be up under the project content area, but I'll double check that one too.
Yeah, there is no short answer questions this week.
Okay. I will fix that in about 5 minutes.